I'm going to ask my questions now and just begin by saying this hearing has nothing to do with any geographic discrimination, any idea that one state or another is oafish. I think that is laughable and sad, almost pathetic. And I say sad because in his opinion for the court, Chief Justice Roberts said, our country has changed. He said, history did not end in 1965. Our country has changed. And one way our country has changed in very dramatic and deeply harmful effect is in what you've just heard. What you've just heard is a partisan diatribe with very little connection to facts. But put aside the tenuous connection to reality. What's most disturbing is the partisan nature of that attack, because the Voting Rights Act used to be bipartisan. It was reauthorized again and again and again with overwhelming bipartisan support because it protected the right to vote, which is a deeply American value. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not Southern, it's not Northeast. I'm proud of the fact that the Connecticut legislature has approved an amendment to the state constitution to allow for early in-person voting, which will be on the ballot in 2022. I'm proud that in June, Connecticut became the latest state to restore voting rights for people with felony convictions. I'm proud that the Connecticut House recently expanded the franchise by expanding access to absentee ballots with a bipartisan majority. Connecticut is moving in the right direction. But it has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican, because there was support among Republicans and Democrats for those changes in the law. And in my opening statement, I said nothing about Republicans. It was solely about the right to vote and about expanding and protecting the franchise against efforts to contract it. So far from disapproving or disparaging any state based on any characteristics, in fact, I laud and admire the efforts of, for example, members of the legislature in southern states like Florida, Georgia, Texas, to resist laws suppressing the right to vote. The fact of the matter is, as my colleague from Georgia said, Raphael Warnock, some people just don't want some people to vote. That's what we have here. And it should never be partisan when we talk about the right to vote. So let me ask Mr. Sines, is stripping the vote from hundreds of thousands of people, as would be done by, for example, the law of Texas, what democracy is all about to you?
Not at all. And let me begin, though, by saying, Senator, that I'm from California, born and raised. You did indicate in my biography I had the privilege of going to school, college and law school in Connecticut. I do not consider myself a Northeasterner. My mother was born in Arizona. My father's family is from New Mexico. The organization that I had was founded in San Antonio, Texas. We still have a thriving office in that state. And no, what you've just described as would occur under the recently enacted law, disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of voters, is not democracy. And ensuring that we have mechanisms in place to swiftly respond before any election moves forward under such a regime is critical to ensuring that voting rights are protected in the future in this country. We have filed at Maldiff a lawsuit against that Texas law. It is just beginning. Because it is under the Voting Rights Act, it will take a long time to resolve. We cannot allow the length of time that these cases take to prevent our protection in the immediate forthcoming elections of those voters. That's why we need the ADR in preclearance.
a number of you have been asked about voter ID laws. My interpretation of your testimony is that you would approve or disapprove voter ID laws and think they pass muster under the Constitution, depending on the law, depending on its provisions, depending on its intent and its effect. Because as we know, most of us in this room are lawyers, that's how you judge laws. You read them and then you judge them on their effect and impact and on their intent. Is that a correct interpretation of your testimony, Assistant Dean Tolson?
Yes, voter ID laws vary. Texas, in particular, has one of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country, and they didn't spend a decade litigating it because of concerns about fraud. The statements made in the Texas legislature indicated that it was to suppress the turnout among Latinos. And it was also very different from the voter ID law litigated in Crawford, which was a facial challenge, and it hadn't went into effect yet, and on its face was not as restrictive as Texas's law.
Mr. Yang?
Absolutely. For example, in my testimony, I talked about the fact that one state legislator essentially suggested that Asian Americans should change their names so that they could comply with voter ID laws or make it simpler to comply with the voter ID laws. We have numerous examples of where you have exact match provisions where, because of the way Asian names have been misspelled historically, have been found to be ineligible to vote or have been forced to cast a provisional ballot and search for the right documentation that, frankly, oftentimes costs money. I understand that free IDs can be offered, but those free IDs, in order to get them, oftentimes requires birth certificates or other documentation that requires money to get.
Mr. Zion?
Yes, Senator, of course. What the Department of Justice would do in evaluating any voter ID provision is apply a well-established standard of intent or retrogression. And if it satisfied that standard, it would be approved. And I hasten to note that any jurisdiction that doesn't trust the Department of Justice, as the state of Texas did prior to Shelby County with its own voter ID law, can choose to bypass the Department of Justice and go to a 3-judge district court here in Washington, D.C., where those judges will apply the exact same well-established standards to carefully evaluate the specifics of that law.
Thank you. I should make the point, by the way, that I would support certain voter ID laws depending on how they are framed, written, what their impact and effect are, and what their intent is going through that kind of analysis. Senator Cornyn?